Hello, and welcome to the Full of Ship podcast. Real answers to real problems. With your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO and co-founder of Vision, a podcast dedicated to demystify the chaotic, often turbulent world of ocean freight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson. And today we have David Applegate, the CEO and founder of ImportYeti. Dave, it's fantastic to have you here in Full of Ship. Maybe we can get started with just learning a bit more about your background, ImportYeti. Give us the intro.
Yeah, well, first off, Kyle, I'm excited to be here. I appreciate the intro. So my business partner and I have an e-commerce store, Wrestling Mart. And we sell, we're the world's largest specialty kind of wrestling products, singlets and shoes like that for the Olympics and colleges. And a long time ago, we wanted to find manufacturers for certain products. And if you're trying to find a product with something that's simple, there's a lot of ways to do that. But if you start to have more complex sourcing design questions, it's hard. And the bill lading data set kind of allowed us to do that. And fast forward to the pandemic. This was kind of my pandemic project, and it has turned into something just beautiful. And so we built something out called ImportYeti, and it helps you visualize any company's supply chain, so you can start to answer fascinating questions like who builds what, where do they build things from? If you're interested in suitcases, what countries make suitcases? If you're looking at a particular manufacturer, who are their top customers? How reliable of a supply chain are they? Just tons and tons of other questions like that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're really, first helped yourselves, but then now helping other companies streamline kind of supplier discovery. Is that how you phrase it, supplier discovery, or is there more to it than that?
I mean, the terminology I like is supply chain design. We're like the Photoshop for building supply chains, if you want to make an analogy. Some people, they have these questions like, if I want to import this product, what should I do? And there's very few things out there that'll actually say, hey, here kind of is the right answer to that individual solution. You're in Vietnam right now, which Vietnam has a phenomenal textile industry. And with most people, they look at textile, they think China, and they don't even think of the question, should I be potentially using Vietnam for footwear or textiles or whatever? And honestly, in a lot of situations, Vietnam is probably the right answer. And we help you come to that conclusion.
Is there a certain type of company or size or, however you want to profile it, that's kind of the ideal user of ImportYeti? Is this is Walmart showing up and asking for this information, or is it more Wrestling Mart size type of thing? Or help me understand who shows up at ImportYeti the most and gets the most value.
Yeah. So, kind of anybody in that category uses it, but they use it for very different use cases. So when people are kind of more in the starting out space, what they're typically looking for is just, I want to find a quality supplier. They're focusing on very simple questions. If they're importing coffee mugs, they legitimately don't know, who a coffee mug manufacturer might be off the top of their head. As you start to get to the higher level things, like you say Walmart or, any sort of Fortune 500 company, they're asking really complex questions, oftentimes associated with risk. So they're starting to say hey, I import coffee mugs out of China, and I'm afraid that my, supply chain is a little too fragile. And so I want to diversify and bring it into multiple areas, or I want to understand how other people in the marketplace are looking at their coffee mug supply chain. And with ImportYeti, you can start to, ask those questions and answer them. Look at who your competitors are. Say, hey, are they using China as well? But also start to say hey, with the coffee mug space, where are the places they're made? Maybe they're made out of China and only China, in which case you just have to say, hey, that's the case. Or maybe it's China and Vietnam and South America. And if that is the case, why would you choose South America over Vietnam? Why would you choose Vietnam over China? Well, the currency issues in, Vietnam are a little more challenging than China. Same with South America, but they've got cheaper labor rates. So you tend to have a lower, final product if your product is heavily based on labor. And, a lot of those things, when you get to those bigger companies, they've got a lot of that kind of internal knowledge already built because they're so adept at their sourcing, profession. What they need is kind of an ability to help visualize how the goods are actually being moved, and then they could tie the other moving pieces together.
Now here at Vision, we really focus on data quality, fidelity, access to the information you need to answer questions is paramount. Now, from what I understand, ImportYeti, yourself, your team, you guys are kind of obsessed with making it easier for your customers to find suppliers. And I'm not sure if that's like find suppliers, like find new suppliers. There might be slightly different use cases there, but in general, how does ImportYeti think about ability to utilize data for this supplier discovery? Like, how do you view data capture, quality, fidelity? What are the challenges that you overcome on behalf of your customers to make it easy for them?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing is that when you start to look at data, there's so much work that oftentimes is done behind the scenes to make it in a presentable format, and if you can take tools like that, I think Vision is the perfect example of this, where you can say, hey, maybe the data is available if you find it another way, but the effort you would have to take to normalize and, make it clean and usable is so insurmountable, that you'd have to spend 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours or whatever the number is. And so doing, it's the really simple things oftentimes, like, how do you, take IKEA, which has 1,000 or 2,000 names in a data set, and normalize it to one name, IKEA, so that, when you search IKEA, you're actually seeing IKEA's data. If you search, what is a container number or a house bill lading number, that it's, the format is consistent and there's no, extra, piece of the data that were accidentally put in there. And all those things, they sound simple, but when you're dealing with hundreds of millions of data points, small amounts of, deviation in certain areas can make things just completely unusable. I say it with tracking all the time. It's like you type in the tracking on certain websites and it just doesn't work. You type in a company name, you just can't find it. You look at a supply chain, and if you type in that company name and you can't find it split across too many entities, then the data is all kind of, all over the place, and you're not looking at a holistic picture.
Now, getting back to how your customers are benefiting from the work you guys do behind the scenes and what are primarily like sources of this type of data? Like, where does ImportYeti get the data that needs to be cleaned? Clean in very big air quotes to get to. And you guys do what? Do you do like a monthly update to your data set, or is it? Tell me a bit more about source and frequency of update and those types of things.
So this data is public. It comes from effectively a combination of Homeland Security and Customs and Border via the Freedom of Information Act. We update it once a month because a lot of these data cleanliness things take so long to do. Doing it at that frequency allows us to keep the cleanest data and really make sure everything is perfectly kind of accurate.
And for that company that's seeking a supplier, what did they traditionally do prior to kind of encountering an ImportYeti? Like how are they even addressing or approaching this challenge of supplier discovery?
It's a good question. So, there's a lot of ways you can find supplier. And if we just kind of rank them, like at first you have the sites like Alibaba, 1688, Global Sources, et cetera, et cetera. Those are great, but there's some issues that are happening with those right now, which is because of the cost to be on those sites and the type of messaging that most suppliers are getting on there. The really adept suppliers are choosing not to use that as a marketing strategy anymore. It used to be the only way you were discovered was at a trade show or on a site like Alibaba, and that's just not the case anymore. And you can imagine if you're a big manufacturer and you sell coffee mugs, let's say your average production run is 100,000 units or something like that. If you're getting 20 messages a day from people on Alibaba, all 20 of them are saying, I want to order 200. And And so that happens enough times and you stop wanting to use those platforms. So the Alibaba and those ecosystems try to gravitate towards the people that are smaller in size, right? I still think the best method for sourcing, period, is getting out, going to trade shows, visiting the suppliers, being kind of, on the ground, so to speak. If you don't have that, probably ImportYeti is the second best choice for finding suppliers. But I don't like to think of it in the terms of, what's best, more so like what role do each one's play? Like Alibaba is stellar for saying like, here's the ISO standards this company abides by. It functions as kind of like a web page with some trust symbols tied to it. A lot of manufacturers in China don't have, they don't think of WordPress and other, site building tools the way people in the US do. You go into those Canton fairs and, other local fairs and, visiting the manufacturers is awesome. ImportYeti provides, a stellar data layer on top of either of those when you're looking at manufacturer to try to, confirm what they say. So if you're seeing a manufacturer in Alibaba, we can say, hey, here's this manufacturer and here's what they actually export. One of the biggest mistakes we see is you'll see manufacturers that let's say they specialize in gear or backpacks, right? They'll also say they make, fanny packs and they make, those camel packs and they make, various fashion equipment. But if they're selling 95% backpacks, you want to choose them to make backpacks and not those other things. And websites and, fair booths and things like that could be misleading. With things like ImportYeti, you could say, what is this person actually moving? You could use their real data to help you make the right supply chain decision.
So with capabilities, tool kind of analysis that can be driven off ImportYeti and the kind of in-person trade show approach, like how have companies evolved their perspective on like the supplier relationship with all these additional tools becoming available?
Yeah. So I think that, like, I understand the question you're asking, but I think it's thought about a little bit differently.
Okay.
The issue is how do some of those tools, how have they negatively impacted probably what would be a supplier relationship building? And it's honestly like the equivalent of online dating. If you're able to send 1,000 messages a day, you tend to have like a cheaper sense of interaction. And platforms like Alibaba and a lot of things have enabled that. I think that there has to be a push more back towards kind of what is like deep conversation and really building a relationship with these vendors. So instead of trying to find 100 people that potentially could supply products, saying what are the 2 or 3 that really are going to probably be the best fits for me, and then really trying to take those and turn them into long-term partnerships where your business goals are aligned. And so when it comes to communication, then kind of the natural thing that flows from that is you really want to focus on slowing things down, getting the two companies to understand each other, making sure that you're, the right fit, kind of sell yourself a little bit more and have them sell themselves a little bit more. And when that kind of starts to happen, what you'll find is that you'll get not only better pricing, but, there'll be much, much less, quality control issues because they are motivated to create products that are going to last because they want the relationship to last. They're going to work with you in a lot of ways that you didn't see fit or you didn't see in the beginning that have kind of evolved. Yeah. So,
it's a business at the end of the day, and so there's some kind of negotiation. I'm kind of wondering, as relationships are getting built and this process of identifying the right fit partner versus the works right now supplier.
Yep.
How does cost management, negotiation of the import export business, how are they leveraging data like ImportYeti's data in those considerations?
Yeah. So when I think of like negotiation and cost management, the first thing I try to say is like, I have to understand how something is like what the actual cost structure of that item is. And so if you take this coffee mug as an example, there's probably like a certain amount of raw goods that go into this. There's labor that goes into this. There's packaging that goes into this. There's tooling costs that go into this. There is, artwork fees, all of these kind of structures that relate to this. And that's just with the physical thing. There's all these other costs too that are kind of outside of the product. Like, what are the shipping costs? What are the inventory carrying costs? What are the inventory storage costs? What are the, it just goes on and on and on. When I start to have a deep understanding of what it actually costs and what the ratios between those different areas are with the product, that's what's going to enable me to run an effective negotiation. And relationship becomes hyper important because some of this information you're likely not going to get unless the manufacturer is willing to share it with you. And they're not going to do that if you don't have that relationship first. But when I do begin to understand those things, then on a per area basis, I can start to figure out how I can create win-win situations with that manufacturer to try to lower the prices. So if we take like this coffee mug example, and there's a labor component to it, what I might use is I'd use ImportYeti to understand the seasonality of the business. I would then think about my current supply chain, and I probably have the same seasonality as, this manufacturer. But if I can order 6 months earlier, and I could go to them and say, hey, do you have excess factory capacity in November or something like that? Because of the fact that, we see that your orders are dropping. Will you, make our products then, store them for 2 months or whatever it is in your factory and ship them to us when they're ready? And if the person was like, oh yeah, we have huge labor, excess in November, we can then split those labor costs where we'll say, hey, you used to have people sitting in the corner doing nothing during that month. Now they're going to be working on products. You pay for 50% of their labor. I'll pay for 50% of their labor. And those sorts of win-wins are what are going to drastically drive down, prices. It's kind of a myth, in my opinion, that you can run a hard negotiation and really bring products down. We're in a competitive marketplace, and the chances of somebody selling a widget for $10 and then you, by just going back and forth over email, are going to hammer them down to $8. I've never seen it happen. Maybe it has happened before, but I personally have never been in that situation. If they really could sell it for $8 in a win-win situation, they would be selling it for $8, because it's a competitive marketplace out there and they want to price their things accordingly. The times I have seen people do very hard price negotiations that aren't win-win, it almost always comes to bite them in the back end when it comes to like product quality or whatever, because the manufacturer sits there and goes, hey, I'm losing $2 in, profit per widget. How am I going to make this up? And when they start asking themselves those questions, they're going to start cutting corners in areas. They're going to say, hey, we can, make our material thinner. We could use this cheaper form of packaging. We could, use lead paint. I don't know what their, the thing is going to end up being. But the point is that, that hard negotiation doesn't work. It's about finding out the cost structures and then getting creative on each one of those things with how you drive them down.
Oh no, our listeners may not all be in the know about all the different types of costs that go into sourcing, a mug or some similar. Maybe you could tell me a bit more about, is the correct phrase it like landed cost, or what term would you use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those terms are a little murky because like technically landed cost would be, we'll say, the cost it takes to get something to your doorstep. But there's typically a lot of costs that aren't in landed cost, quote unquote, that, are still being put in there. So like, as an example, if you're doing something like this mug that, you're using a mug, and let's say that mug hypothetically costs $1 a unit and you're buying 1,000 of them. 75 of them is going to tooling and 35 is going into art design or something like that. So really your, cost per mugs is like, $800 something or whatever the amount is, when it's shipped to your door. Now those are one-time costs, so on your next order, they wouldn't be present there, so you have to ask like, what is the the real cost of kind of those items. And there's all these extra things that are kind of beyond landed costs, like what are your inventory storage costs? What are your working capital costs? Are there any, warehousing costs like barcoding, et cetera, et cetera? I think that the really interesting question is, how do you understand what the true cost structures are for a particular item? And with things like, with most people, in all honesty, are not in situations where they know the product well enough when they're sourcing that they properly understand these things. Like before I made this mug, I didn't know a ton about mugs. I do have some manufacturing experience, so I could assume there's going to be some sort of tooling or there's going to be some sort of artwork fee. But I have no idea how much of this is labor, how much of this is, raw goods. I just don't know these things. And so the ways I try to figure this out is, first off, a lot of research. YouTube is your friend with this stuff. I know it sounds simple, but like search how it's made coffee mugs, and there'll be some YouTube video where there's a factory in, Thailand or China, and they're showing you how coffee mugs are made. The next thing is I really work with vendors to understand their manufacturing processes. Oftentimes they'll be hesitant to tell you straight up cost structures, but they're very open to telling you how something is made and to try to understand or try to kind of teach you about the process if you have the right, mindset going in. And then you can draw very reasonable conclusions from that. So they're showing you how the mug's made. These things are hand painted. I would assume that there was a machine that would just stamp this thing on, but they hand paint mugs. And I'm like, oh, interesting. I know it's going to take a long time for somebody to hand paint 1,000 of these things. And if you're buying the mug for $1 and you know what the average hourly rate is inside China, you can start to attribute, you don't have to be perfectly accurate, but you say, hey, this is largely a labor-based product. And, the raw parts of it are very, very cost effective. And then when it comes to certain things, I straight up ask. So if you're talking about like packaging as an example, I'll phrase questions like, hey, what are the 5 packaging options that people have used? What are the pros and cons to them? And they'll tell you, hey, we typically package things this way, but we've also done this way and this way. And you can make your decisions based off that.
Now, much of our audience is in the logistics world.
Yep.
Surely some of it's also in the supply chain world. So I was kind of wondering about the transportation, the freight side. How is that part of the conversation? How does that play out with the supplier? I know the different terms, et cetera, but where does that come into the consideration of the cost?
Yeah. So I think it's probably one of the most least thought about components of it. It's fascinating. People will spend a crazy amount of time to try to drive their mug costs down, 6 cents or whatever a mug, but they won't spend any time with their freight forwarding or the other derivatives of logistics. One of the biggest things I see is the way packaging relates to transportation costs. People will spend so much time trying to say, how can I save a penny here or there? When it comes to packaging, they'll never ask the question, how can I package these things as efficiently as possible? And in most situations I work with, there's a huge opportunity to reduce the amount of package footprint and therefore, increase the average, product per container by 10, 20, 30%. Huge thing. The next thing with, logistics that plays a huge role, I think this revision API really kind of comes into play, is if you can start to understand where your inventory is in its current state. This container of mugs is 30 days out, it's 20 days out, it's stuck at port, it's whatever. You can begin to understand how that affects what your current inventory should look like. And when people talk about, the total cost of an item, what they're oftentimes not thinking about is the profit that you're really trying to get. Cost is I'm not saying it's a fictional number, but you don't make the money until you actually sell the goods. And if you have, if you've got, we'll say you sell 10 items and you make $2, that's a worst case scenario than selling 100 items at $1. And so if you're able to utilize various analytics to try to understand how do I correctly keep inventory in stock, How do I ensure I'm maintaining the lowest inventory levels to keep my working capital costs low, to keep my warehousing costs low? The opportunity is just, it's massive. When I just think of my own e-commerce store, the percentage of money I've lost from stockouts is like, it's staggering.
Sizable companies, you mentioned earlier, part of the equation in supplier selection, supply chain design, network design is risk management. Can you tell me a little bit more about, the risk management components of the supplier selection, the risk management components in that true landed cost, if that's the right phrase, or other parts of types or elements of risk that people should be considering, but they're not?
Yeah. So the way I like to think of risk as is kind of cost associated with the probability. So if you take, we'll say freight forwarding costs, right? And let's say it's $2,000 to move a container, which is roughly what it's been forever until this pandemic. Realistically, it wasn't $2,000 to move a container. It was $2,000 that day, but it could have gone up to $8,000 or it could have dropped down to $1,000. And you could bake those prices in to what your container movage costs are. And that applies to a lot of things. So if you take the labor as an example, if you're importing coffee mugs and that coffee mug costs $1 and 50 cents is going to labor and 50 cents is going to, goods, and I'm oversimplifying that equation, and you're making these in China and the labor rate's double, right? Then your product really becomes, you have to pay $150 for it. If you've got a product and, you can't import it into the country because of a supply chain disruption, that cost should effectively be distributed across the products you sell. So I really like to try to say, what would happen? What are the different things that could happen? What is the percentage of them happening? And then try to attribute them to product cost. Because if you can't do that, it ends up too esoterical. And it's just like, if something happens in China and we can't import out of China anymore, that would be bad. Whereas if you could say, hey, if our supplier can't meet this, this demand and we lose 50% of our profit for the year, and there's a 50% chance of that happening versus a 2% chance of that happening, you react differently. So if you can really try to bake that risk almost into your cost structures, it makes it feel very real. And then you start to ask the question, if there is a material risk to your cost, how do you go about, alleviating that risk? And I think that's when you get into the supply chain design kind of questions. If you're looking at, let's say you're moving furniture and you're going, man, if freight forwarding costs, let's say, jump from, $2,000 a container to $20,000 a container, it goes up tenfold. And we are the ones that import it out of China and everyone else is making things in the US. Our, product costs would be so high, we wouldn't be able to compete in that situation and our business would go under. In that situation, you go, okay, given that fact, what kind of move we need to make that not be applicable? And so you could maybe try to find a local supplier. Doesn't mean you have to do 100% of your stuff out of there, but at least have the relationship built so that if something like that does happen, you don't feel the pain in the same way. As you walk through these thought exercises, what you'll begin to realize is that a lot of risks are immaterial. Really, it doesn't make a difference. We take the coffee mug analogy. I use these as promotional items for ImportYeti. And if I couldn't bring them in, wouldn't be a big deal. Now, if there was something that stopped my business from making money, I would behave very differently. Does that kind of make sense what I'm saying there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I feel like that was a little bit esoterical.
Yeah, no. I mean, especially your last point there. Like, if you look at the silicon issue, the being able to get processors in the States over the last 2 years or so, that's definitely one of those situations where there are manufacturing process blocker components.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where you definitely want to be factoring risk in that regard. We talked earlier in our chat about, a little bit of, building ImportYeti. What drove you to create this project? You said it was your COVID project. I'm kind of curious to go back to that topic a bit. What have been some of the challenges in building ImportYeti, both as, your offering as well as the business around it?
Yeah. So for me, I try to stay really close to the customer. And when we first started it, I didn't know what it was going to become. In fact, the very first version of ImportYeti was me running reports in Tableau, or someone saying, I'm trying to run this search. And I manually run it, send them a PDF of what it was. The big things, I've learned as we go about this is just, I guess how little I know about a lot of this stuff. And when you kind of take that mindset, you start to, it's really eye-opening because you can say, okay, what do I need to do to get a little better every single day? How do I expand my knowledge? 1%. The big trends I've seen kind of in the building is, one, how we're starting to shift from what I would consider a China-centric importing culture, where almost everything was coming out of Taiwan, China, Hong Kong kind of area, to these other countries. And it just happened to be, the fact that the pandemic happened as I was building it, was a mixed blessing. But now people are starting to think about all these problems that we're able to help them with that we didn't think about at first. Because as you move from China into Vietnam, there's all of these, issues that you didn't have to think about. It's almost like you're buying a car and you've been using a gasoline engine forever. And now you've got an electric car. And now you have to think about like charging stations. And you have to think about, does your house have the correct, voltage going to the garage? And, what about, do you ever go past a certain range when you're driving? And those equivalents in the supply chain space are like, how does, transferring of funds differ between China and Vietnam? How does Forex differ between these countries? Chinese, currencies effectively pegged the US dollar. So the volatility is next to nothing. That is not the case in places like Vietnam and South America. And if you are going to import a product that costs $1, there's a chance that it costs that manufacturer to make that product $1.20, 3 months later, or cost them 60 cents, or whatever kind of the fluctuation is. Those are extreme examples, but that stuff does happen, especially if you're working in a place like Argentina. And so really kind of, staying close to the customer and trying to say, how can we solve the issues they're facing today? It's kind of been the more, they were not issues I was facing myself, but, it's what kind of market was demanding. That, and then how slow the supply chain has moved, or supply chain like knowledge moves. When you look at some industries, there's just so much knowledge around it. And there's so many like communal places people focus. In the supply chain and logistics space, there's not those hubs of information. So it's really hard to get ideas to disseminate. And we've tried very hard to get ImportYeti into a lot of people's minds. It's not like the normal startup scene where you come up with an idea, you hit a bunch of press, and then everyone hears about you in, 2 weeks.
Well, David, I think it's time in the conversation to start gathering our kind of closing thoughts. So any advice you'd offer to newcomers or established players in the supply chain industry that you haven't mentioned already? What would you advise to help someone reach success who might be out there with a supplier challenge?
Yeah. The biggest thing for me is trying to find other people with divergent thoughts to be in your circle so that you can ask questions and hear differing points of view on how to handle things. And finding these people like conventions, I think are really, really great. Just trying to find locations online where people congregate in this spot, and just get good at asking those questions like, hey, here's the supply chain issue or logistics issue I'm having. How do you guys handle it? I'm always shocked at the answers I hear back. It's very rarely I hear something I'm like, man, that's a bad idea. It's rather you start to build much more kind of robust knowledge and a different set of, ways to solve problems. And you can find ImportYeti going to ImportYeti.com. It's free. Just check it out. And you can send me a message directly on the website. One thing I would love is if anybody has any feedback at all, please let me know. Even the smallest things on the site, like I hate the way this button is, or the biggest thing, like I wish it would do this. I want to hear any and all thoughts on it.
Why Yeti?
This is kind of an embarrassing story. Yeah, I'm almost ashamed to say this, but when we were starting the site, a few of the things that became very apparent was everybody who had similar websites, it would be like, import expertise. And then you'd hear the person, you talk with a customer and they'd be like, I was using this site. It was called import something. And I was like, okay, I can't fall into that trap. And so I started to go, what are things that would be easy to spell, short, and would stick in someone's mind. And I don't know how the running came down to these things, but it's between Import Pimp and ImportYeti. And, I was talking with users and everybody was saying Import Pimp. And I don't know why they would say it because it's the worst idea ever. And then somebody said the most astute comment. They're like, hey, listen, I am never going to put Import Pimp on my corporate credit card, And I was like, valid. And then ImportYeti it was.
Well, David, thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us on the Vision podcast. Thank you on behalf of our listeners and, of course, myself. This has been another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson, and this was David Applegate, CEO, ImportYeti.
Thank you for joining Kyle and his guest on the Full of Ship podcast. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time as Kyle continues to demystify ocean carrier tracking with his future guests.